A number of years ago, Minnesota Vikings running back Adrian Peterson was suspended by the National Football League for an entire season. The reason for his suspension had nothing to do with violating the substance abuse policy in the NFL. He was suspended for child abuse. His child abuse consisted of hitting his 4-year-old son with a switch and leaving a mark on him. Well, not to downplay what Adrian Peterson did, I believe there is a much more serious form of child abuse that goes on in hundreds of thousands of households. I fully agree with Richard Dawkins that raising a child in Christianity is child abuse. And I say that for at least 3 reasons. The first is that raising a child in Christianity teaches a child to value stupidity over intelligence. He is taught, or she is taught, about talking snakes, about virgins having babies, about corpses rising from the dead. This has serious consequences in their subsequent life. In an article in BuzzFeed written by Rachel Zerl in 2014, she writes, it's difficult for young children to differentiate between fact and fiction after they have been exposed to religion. A new study in this month's issue of Cognitive Science says. Researchers presented 66 5- and 6-year-old children from public and religious schools 3 types of stories: religious, fantastical, and realistic, to determine if they could identify fictional elements in the narratives. The authors found that when presented with stories that included ordinarily impossible events brought about by divine intervention, children who had been exposed to religion were less able to differentiate the made-up elements like talking animals as fiction. What happens when these children grow to adulthood and they've been taught from the earliest childhood to value stupidity over intelligence? 75 to 80% of them believe Donald Trump. That's what happens. And I believe any parent who teaches his child or her child to value stupidity over intelligence is a child abuser. Basically, we come down to the fact that the teachings of Christianity are essentially preposterous nonsense, and we all know that. How do you get a child to believe preposterous nonsense? In the most honest statement he ever made during his ministry, Reverend Billy Graham said, "Intellectual persuasion has never won a soul to Jesus Christ." And he was absolutely right. There are only 2 ways to get people to believe preposterous nonsense, and both of them constitute child abuse. The first is you scare them into it. You tell them that unless they believe this preposterous nonsense, they are going to suffer an eternity of pain, torture, and agony in a place called hell. And in fact, a number of churches actually form what are called hell houses. They're like haunted houses, except they depict the agony you're going to suffer in hell. In an online article called Vice, the author states, "Scaring people into salvation has often been part of the Christian tradition," according to Armory Griffith, director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Dante wrote about it in the Inferno, and Puritans had their own way of scaring Christians with the afterlife. But the immersive medium of a hell house is a somewhat new way of scaring people into virtue, and it is terrifying. I believe that any parent who scares his or her children with stories of eternal suffering and torture in hell is a child abuser. Now, the second way that people believe preposterous nonsense is, I think, even more insidious and evil than scaring them with hell. It is best illustrated by one of the most famous Christian hymns of all, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me, a wretch like me. If you are raised in fundamentalist Christianity, you are taught from the earliest childhood, you are a wretch, you are a sinner, you are worthless. You get eternal damnation, suffering, and torture because that's exactly what you deserve. And there's nothing you can do to improve your life that will change that at all. The book of Romans says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The fundamental tactic of Christianity is to destroy the child's sense of self-esteem and self-worth. He is told that pride is the greatest of all sins. And having destroyed that sense of self-worth, the only salvation is the grace of Jesus Christ. Self-esteem destroyed, and you're just dependent upon Jesus Christ as the heroin addict is upon its fix. And anybody who does that to a child is a child abuser. Now, there are things we can do about the Adrian Peterson version of child support. We can fine them. We can send them to prison. We can suspend them from playing football. No such remedies are available for the child abuse inherent in fundamental Christianity. Indeed, the very free exercise of the First Amendment that allows all of us to be atheists protects the child abuse inherent in Christianity. And the only thing that we as atheists can do is call it out when we see it, and that's what I intend to do, Mr. Toastmaster.